The Six-Day War may have possibly, for the first time, stirred in the Middle East the beginnings of a process leading to peace. Those are the words that the Israeli Prime Minister, Levi Eshkol, told the United States President Lyndon Johnson in January 1968. However, United States Secretary of State Dean Rusk was more prophetic when he said that Israel's keeping the West Bank would create a revanchism for the rest of the 20th century. Welcome to Operation History. 52 years ago, 6 days of war caused repercussions that shaped the modern Middle East. The Six-Day War, also known as the June War and the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, was fought between Israel and the neighboring states of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria from June 5th through 10th, 1967. The Six-Day War was caused by a failure to secure a lasting peace after the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. That war was a brief but bloody battle that altered the political map in the Middle East. The continued failure to win the peace after the Six-Day War resulted in over 50 years of violence in the Middle East, ranging from simmering unrest to all-out war. Following the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Arab leaders continued to be concerned about their past military losses and the plight of thousands of Palestinian refugees after the Arab-Israeli War. The Arab League created the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, in 1964 in an attempt to control Palestinian nationalism but to also champion its cause. In the period leading up to June 1967, tensions became dangerously heightened. November 1964, the Israeli Defense Force, or IDF, and Israeli settlements came under Syrian artillery fire from the Golan Heights. The IDF struck back, destroying 2 tanks and several earth-moving machines that were attempting to divert the headwaters of the Jordan River. May 1965. Israel retaliated for the killing of 6 Israelis by striking the West Bank. In 1966, Israel recorded 93 border incidents, including mines, shootings, and sabotage. August 1966, the Israeli Air Force shot down 2 Syrian MiGs, attempting to attack an Israeli border patrol boat that had run aground in the demilitarized zone in the Sea of Galilee. April 1967, Syria and Israel fought an air and artillery engagement. The Israeli Air Force shot down 6 Syrian fighter jets. After the skirmishes between the Israelis and the Syrians, the Soviet Union provided the Arab nations with intelligence information that Israel was going to move troops to its northern border for an invasion of Syria. As with similar information provided to the Soviets twice in the past, that information turned out to be wrong. In response to a Syrian request for assistance, Egyptian President Nasser mobilized Egyptian forces by moving them into the Sinai Peninsula. Nasser expelled the United Nations Emergency Force in the Sinai. On May 22, 1967, Nasser banned Israeli shipping from the Straits of Tiran, the direct passage to the sea connecting the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba. A week later, Nasser sealed a defense pact with the King Hussein of Jordan. Israeli intelligence chief Aaron Yariv told Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, "If Israel takes no action in response to the blockade of the Straits, she will lose her credibility and the IDF its deterrent capacity. The Arab states will interpret Israel's weakness as an excellent opportunity to threaten her very existence." Israeli Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin continued, "We have to admit the truth. First we'll strike Egypt, and then we'll fight Syria and Jordan as well. Eshkol told Rabin, "The IDF will not attack before the political options have been exhausted." President Lyndon Johnson tried to broker a peace by trying to get international support for reopening the Straits of Tiran to Israel. However, that effort failed. On June 5th, 1967, at 7:10 a.m., Israel launched a series of preemptive airstrikes against Egyptian airfields. A series of fortunate events helped the Israelis. The Egyptian planes were parked on the runways, their pilots eating breakfast. The Egyptians had changed their encoding frequencies, leaving a Jordanian warning of the impending attack indecipherable. The Egyptian defense minister was sleeping with strict orders not to be disturbed, and Egypt's anti-aircraft batteries and surface-to-air missile sites were ordered not to fire by Egypt's Deputy Supreme Commander, Abd al-Hakim Amir, whose transport plane was in the air at the time of the attacks. Approximately 90% of the Egyptian Air Force was destroyed on the ground, and all but one Egyptian airfield was rendered unusable. By the end of the day, Israel had air superiority in the Middle East. At the same time, the Israelis launched a ground offensive into the Gaza Strip and the Sinai, which again caught the Egyptians by surprise. After some initial resistance, President Nasser ordered the evacuation of the Sinai. Israel's forces rushed westward in pursuit of the Egyptians, inflicted heavy losses, and conquered the Sinai. Nasser brought Syria and Jordan into the war and convinced them to begin attacks on Israel by claiming that Egypt defeated the Israeli Air Force. Israeli counterattacks resulted in the seizure of East Jerusalem and the West Bank from the Jordanians. Although Syria made initial gains into Israel, Israel's counterattacks against Syria resulted in the occupation of the Golan Heights. The United Nations brokered a ceasefire that took effect on June 10, 1967. United Nations Resolution 242 was adopted by the United Nations in an attempt to bring lasting peace after the Six-Day War. Israel supported the resolution because it called for Israel to live in peace with secure and recognized boundaries free from the threats or act of force. Egypt and Jordan accepted the resolution because it called for Israel to withdraw from the territories it conquered in 1967. The PLO did not accept it until 1988 because it didn't specifically mention a Palestinian right of return. Instead, the resolution simply calls for a just resolution of the refugee problem. Estimates were that 20,000 Arabs and 800 Israelis died during the 132 hours of fighting. The aftermath of the war resulted in an increase of Israeli national pride due to its successes during the war. Arab leaders were further inflamed after the war. They met in Khartoum, Sudan, in August 1967 and passed the 3 No's resolution: no peace, no recognition, and no negotiation with Israel. After coming to power in 1970, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat indicated to the United Nations envoy that he was willing to sign a peace agreement with Israel if it agreed to return the territories captured in 1967. When Israel and the United States ignored that outreach, Egypt and Syria launched an attack on Israel on the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur on October 6, 1973. The conflict that resulted is called the Yom Kippur or Ramadan War, depending on whether you are Jewish or Muslim. The Egyptians attacked Israeli forces in the Sinai Peninsula, and the Syrians retook the Golan Heights. The Arab armies had impressive victories due to the element of surprise by timing the attack on the holy day, and also due to the use of new Soviet weapon technology, such as anti-tank missiles. Iraqi forces also joined the war, and the Syrians received support from Jordan. The United States airlifted military weapons to the Israelis. Eventually, the Israeli Defense Force pushed back the Arab armies. However, the victory came at great cost to Israel. Israelis were critical of the government's lack of preparedness, and as a result, the Israeli Prime Minister, Golda Meir, stepped down. After the war, U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger pursued agreements to secure partial Israeli withdrawals from the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. However, Kissinger ignored issues such as the fate of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. In late 1977, Anwar Sadat reached out to Israel on his own. He visited Jerusalem on November 19, 1977. That led to a meeting between Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin in 1978 at Camp David in Maryland at the invitation of President Jimmy Carter. The thought was that Sadat had extended an olive branch to try to carry favor with the United States. Egypt was hurting economically and thought it would benefit from improved relations with the United States. As a result of the meeting, Egypt and Israel worked out two agreements. The first formed the basis for the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement, was signed in 1979. The second agreement proposed to give the Palestinians control over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip after 5 years. In the interim, a self-governing authority was to rule those areas. Only the Egyptian-Israeli agreement was implemented. The Palestinians and other Arab states would not agree to the second agreement because Israel was not required to completely withdraw from territories occupied in 1967, and it did not set up a Palestinian nation-state. On December 9, 1987, the first Intifada, which means shaking off, began in the Israeli-occupied Gaza Strip. The riots and violence started after an Israeli truck crashed into a station wagon filled with Palestinian workers in the refugee district of Gaza. 4 Palestinians were killed and 10 were wounded. Palestinians took to the streets and attacked Israeli police and troops with rocks and Molotov cocktails. Israeli paratroopers were sent in to stop the violence in Gaza and the West Bank. To put this in context, 1987 marked the 20-year anniversary of the Six-Day War. The Intifada was soon controlled by Palestinian leaders. Affluent Palestinians joined with the refugees in trying to gain Palestinian independence by engaging in strikes and boycotts. Israeli Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin tried to crush the Intifada with force. From 1987 to 1991, Israeli troops killed over 1,000 Palestinians, including 200 under the age of 16. At the end of 1988, PLO leader Yasser Arafat surprisingly denounced terrorism and recognized the State of Israel's right to exist. However, violence continued. Most of the leaders of the Intifada had been arrested by 1990. Political division and violence within the Palestinian movement began to arise. There were growing factions between various Palestinian factions and Islamist groups, including Hamas and the Islamic Jihad. In fact, Palestinian militants killed approximately 250 Palestinians were thought to be collaborating with the occupying forces. In 1992, Yitzhak Rabin became the Prime Minister of Israel. He vowed to move swiftly on the peace process. To demonstrate his commitment to peace, he froze new Israeli settlements in the occupied territory and called off the Intifada. When the U.S. and Israel refused to respond to Yasser Arafat's move to denounce terrorism and recognize Israel, the PLO opposed the United States' attack on Iraq in the Gulf War in 1991. The PLO did not support Saddam's annexation of Kuwait. However, it did see Saddam's challenge to the United States and other Gulf oil exporting states as a way to bring attention back to Palestine. In response, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia cut off financial support to the PLO, and the role of the PLO in the region was minimized. Yitzhak Rabin then believed that the Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other Islamic movements were a greater threat than the PLO. Therefore, Rabin reversed his long-standing position and began negotiations with the PLO as a way to combat the influence of more radical Islamic groups. Israel initiated secret talks with the PLO in Oslo, Norway. The talks led to the signing of a declaration of principles on the interim self-government arrangements, commonly referred as the Oslo Accord, at the White House. In the agreement, the PLO renounced terrorism and recognized Israel's right to exist as a nation. In return, Israel accepted the PLO as the representative of the Palestinians. Both sides also agreed that a Palestinian Authority would be established to assume governing responsibilities in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip over a 5-year period. Then, permanent status talks on the issues of borders, refugees, and Jerusalem would be held. In May 1994, a further agreement was reached in Cairo. The Cairo Accord finalized Israel's withdrawal from most of the Gaza and Jericho. A third agreement, called the Taba, or Oslo II, was made in September 1995. The Oslo II agreement divided the West Bank into separate areas that were under Israeli control, Palestinian control, and Israeli military responsibility with Palestinian civil administration. Oslo II also spelled out provisions for elections, civil/legal affairs, and other bilateral Israeli-Palestinian cooperation on various issues. In January 1996, elections were held for the Palestinian Legislative Council. Yasser Arafat won that election. The processes set up under the Oslo Accords was supposed to have yielded a final outcome by May 1999. However, Israel was reluctant to finally give up the occupied territories, and there was reluctance on both sides to make the final concessions that were needed to reach an ultimate resolution. Additionally, there were violent outbreaks with Palestinian opponents of the Oslo process, particularly of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. During the Oslo Accord process, Israel set up settlements in the occupied territories and set up roads to bypass Palestinian areas to get Israelis from settlements in the occupied territories to Israel. Palestinians viewed these as actions intended to expand Israeli territory and thereby reduce the size of the Palestinians viewed these as actions intended to expand Israeli territory and thereby reduce the size of a Palestinian state. Final negotiations only started in the mid-2000s. Israel withdrew from some of the occupied territory, leaving the Palestinian Authority in control of 45% of the West Bank and 60% of the Gaza Strip. However, Israel retained control of the area surrounding the Palestinian-controlled settlements, thereby controlling the entrance and exit to and from that land. It had become apparent to the Palestinians that the Oslo process had not yielded the desired result. In July of 2000, President Clinton invited Prime Minister Barak and Palestinian Authority head Arafat to Camp David for Camp David II. The parties could not reach an agreement because Israel would not agree to return to its pre-1967 borders. Israel also would not give up control over East Jerusalem and would annex parts of the West Bank comprising 80% of Jewish settlements. Arafat would not yield to the United States and Israeli pressure to reach an agreement. As a result of the failure of the peace process, the Second Intifada began in September 2000. On September 28th, Ariel Sharon visited Temple Mount in Jerusalem with 1,000 armed guards. This led to Palestinian protests, and the Israeli military killed 6 unarmed Palestinians. The Second Intifada was more deadly than the first because both sides now possessed weapons. By the end of 2005, over 1,000 Israelis and 3,000 Arabs were dead. Conflicts between Palestinian factions increased after the Second Intifada. Yasser Arafat's death in 2004 led to the election of Mohammed Abbas. Abbas was not as strong a leader as Arafat and had never been an advocate of violence. Tensions became especially heated when Hamas won the Palestinian legislative elections in 2006. The United States, the European Union, Israel, Russia, and the United Nations demanded that Hamas accept all previous agreements and Israel's right to exist. Hamas refused. In February 2007, Saudi negotiations in Mecca established Palestinian National Unity Government. Abbas signed the agreement and swore in ministers. Hamas took control over Gaza in 2007 and elected Ismail Haniyeh as its leader. Hamas continues to govern in Gaza and refuses to recognize the National Unity Government. Conflict continues to exist between Israel and the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Tempers flared recently after President Trump declared that it would move its embassy to Jerusalem. The United States opened its embassy in Jerusalem on May 14, 2018, the same day as the 70th anniversary of the Israeli Declaration of Independence. Jared Kushner has also recently indicated that the administration plans to move away from a two-state solution and support Jerusalem as Israel's capital. These developments make it increasingly likely that the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians will continue to be heated and violent in the time ahead.